Welcome everyone to the CAIS YouTube channel. I am David Cormier, CAIS Managing and Production Editor. Today we are sitting down with Jocelyn Cranefield to discuss her Paul Gray award-winning paper, Political Satire in the Counterframing of Public Sector IT Project Escalation. So Jocelyn, if you would, please summarize the thesis and major findings of your paper for our viewers.
Thank you, David. Much appreciate the opportunity. And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper, Professor Gillian Oliver, who's now at Monash University, and Professor Jan Priesheimer, who's at Roskilde in Denmark. Let's say when we started this paper, we were kind of intrigued by the calls for use of alternative satire, use of alternative genre in information systems research, and that's kind of what motivated us to start off with. And I really recall thinking, Gillian suggesting one morning, let's look at satire, because we had some major government IT project that was failing rather catastrophically and impacting badly on teachers in New Zealand, and that they were actually not being paid. And it was a payroll project. So that's kind of where we came from. And the thesis is really trying to understand what role political satire can play as a mechanism in helping to understand project escalation in the case of government IT projects, and particularly looking at big projects where things are starting to go wrong. So the other area of interest in terms of research that we looked at was the research into project failure and project escalation and de-escalation. Because as you'll know, there's been a huge amount of research go into, well, what are the critical success factors, what things go wrong, and coming up with a list of things to do to fix projects. But the research into de-escalation really highlights the importance of framing and how dominant frames can prevent, and commitment of escalation. One of the things is commitment to a certain way of viewing things can actually prevent acknowledging the problem and reversing the problem. And I think it's Montalegre and Montalegre and Keel in the paper in 2000 actually identified that counterframing was really quite a creative process, but it was really important to challenge and expose dominant frames. So we thought, well, let's actually look and try and understand how is political satire actually operating on the ground. So we had a lot of fun. We identified two projects, one in New Zealand, one in Denmark, that were really big IT projects where things had gone wrong to the extent that the public were being negatively impacted on. In the case of New Zealand, school teachers, principals. In the case of Denmark, everybody who was trying to use the trains and public transport. And we found a whole body of political satire in the form of cartoons that was savagely critiquing what was going on. So what we did is we look at using, initially we just did some inductive coding, and then really grateful actually for the AE who was helpful in suggesting, well, how about looking at technological frames of reference? And we found it was a fabulous fit, that these cartoonists were kind of intuitively commenting through exaggeration and parody to expose quite bizarre framing of technology that had occurred around using technology. So we actually applied this, looking at the frames. We identified 6 different counter frames that the cartoonists were using. And it was really exposing and parodying what was really going on in the case of massively failing systems, just continuing to be kind of normalized, and people suffering, not being able to afford food. Some teachers in New Zealand were in fact being overpaid by millions of dollars, and the reverse was happening. So the frames that we found relating to the nature of technology which is interesting because it's intuitive work on the part of a satirist or a cartoonist. They do this really intuitively, but they very much, number of different cartoons, they identified technology as being broken or sick or useless, and use a lot of very powerful visual metaphors. Things like, a sick dog, Frankenstein, very visual images around this. And the other frame was around technology being dangerous or out of control. And this was interesting because, as researchers, we don't use these kind of metaphors, but there would be all these metaphors of minotaurs and marauding crocodiles and, dangerous things threatening the users of the technology. In terms of technology in use as a frame domain, we identified 4 different frames, or counter frames. One was victimizing the customers and the users, and that was used with, enormous humor is drawn on to exaggerate what's actually going on. So, for example, there's a cartoon where we see teachers who are skeletal because they haven't eaten for weeks. They're stuck in a classroom, and there's marauding crocodiles and large birds eating them. There's blood spurting everywhere. They've got signs saying we haven't been paid. But meanwhile, the minister in charge of the project is writing on the blackboard, their students in the classroom, SNAFU, snafu, situation normal. So there's technology in use. Another one is normalization of the perverse, and we see that theme very significantly used in both of the projects. Also, the theme of evading responsibility. And at this point, we are now also drawing on stakeholder theory and actually looking at how it's invoked by satirists, kind of unconsciously. They're not looking at the theory, but we found that all 4 of the moral principles identified by Goschuk and Solly Sather were actually drawn on by satirists, and that they are honouring agreements or failing to do it, avoiding lying. We get a lot of reference, particularly in the New Zealand satire, to lying on the part of politicians, and respecting autonomy of others. These systems are taking away people's autonomy. People in Denmark are being put into stocks because they can't pay with their Danish travel card, and avoiding others. So the last theme is just incompetent control, and we see again, once the powerful stakeholders are actually put in charge to try to rectify the problem, that the theme is that there's the lack of competence. The thing is dragging on. So these counterframes are really powerful, and we were kind of excited about how extraordinarily well it fitted with some theory. So I guess our thesis is that we suggest that this actually might be valuable as a tool, perhaps to managers. We know that we were working with kind of virtuosic satirists, but satire as a tool may be useful when you're looking at major IT projects, actually trying to help to play around exposing what are the dominant frames, how might we parody, exaggerate, and particularly also focusing on stakeholders who are the weaker stakeholders. So that's a very strong part of what satirists do, and it's less common, I think, for organisations to do that once they've committed to multi-million-dollar projects.
So, Jocelyn, what do you think is then, of all of those interesting things that you've just discussed, what do you think is the most thought-provoking?
I think there's a few layers to what I think is thought-provoking. I was particularly intrigued that satirists are just intuitively able to be working with things that, researchers have spent time developing as theories. They don't require the theories. They are actually invoking these moral principles So I think this is quite thought-provoking, that actually we can look at satire as a mechanism, as a tool that's actually quite structured in what it does, and potentially, and this is thought-provoking, suggest that there might be a way that it could be employed by managers as a complementary tool to looking at other ways of dealing with project escalation and de-escalation. Once it's been recognised, I think it may be helpful, and we suggest potentially, because it is quite a skilled thing, that satirists could perhaps be brought in to assist with workshops, but also managers, if they're sensitised to understanding satire, actually may be able to use it. And we find it interesting that research into IT, occupational culture, shows that humour is really important to a lot of people who work in tech. So I guess this is a little bit of thought provocation. Can we bring in humour into a huge disastrous thing that's gone wrong, and let it help guide and bring people to help to reframe what's happening and what could be done?
Have your thoughts on the topic changed? Has there been any significant new research or examples dealing with satire and IT or IS?
So there's been some interesting research. I've just I had a look actually yesterday, and I found there's been a paper written by Dudezeret and some co-authors in Information and Organisation. They actually used cartoon asterisk to actually try to understand how knowledge management systems were being appropriated by organisations. Actually, they did work with this as to establish a common frame of reference. So I found that really interesting, because actually they've taken the next step. It's not political satire per se, it's a very well understood kind of set of values and frames. But I think this is useful, that we actually are seeing research where this is actually, drawing on cartoons with management. So I think that's fascinating. And has my own thinking changed? I guess the main thing would be that with what we looked at, we're looking at very formal, traditional satire from the British American tradition. And we're also looking at cartoons that have been published in media. But in the course of doing research, we identified a large amount of user-generated content. And I think this is a really ripe area for research. I'm not yet working in that area, but there's an enormous amount of I guess, fascinating stuff happening with satire. And it seems that satire has, in fact, been enabled by the internet and networked technologies. And there's actually a paper by Kumar and Combe, and it's in the communications field, just looking at how it's really become a network practice. And many people are taking part in it. And it's also now coming from other cultures, non-Western cultures. So I guess my thinking in that sense is that there's a huge potential to look further at the role of satire, maybe not only in relation to IT projects, but in relationship to technologies. We can, in terms of user-generated satire, we can see a lot just around generative AI. An example would be Google's Gemini AI, where, in the attempt to correct bias in the training data, a whole lot of unintentional humour and satire has been generated. People have been criticising Google, and it's led to a whole lot of memes and use of satire. And I think there's a really huge opportunity there to look at the interplay between emerging technologies and the use of satire, and what it can tell us around concerns for the future of AI in particular. Also, autonomous weapons. There's a lot of cartoons out there, both in the formal media and in user-generated content around drones. So
yeah. Jocelyn, what are you working on now? Anything related or anything else at all? Any research interests that you're currently working on?
Well, I'm having sort of started looking at satire again. I wish I was working on related stuff, always open to it. But at the moment, a lot of my work is, I guess, like many people, intrigued by the consequences of people working with generative AI tools. So some of my work is actually looking at the role-related impacts of that work with Young Press Hire, looking at the use of generative AI in project management and how it's changing the nature of project management in IT. In another area, with Gillian Oliver, so I'm still working with the authors of this paper, looking actually at data culture and what different data cultures exist around the use of data. And so at the moment, that's kind of exploratory stage. And we've been trying to look at what people view as the optimum or ideal data culture. And that's quite fun, because we're seeing, depending on the role that somebody takes, they might have quite a different view of that. And another one is, again, looking at what individual workers are doing and thinking about how they're using emerging technologies, and again, particularly generative AI, large language models, and how are people thinking about the ethical considerations and applying those and how they use the tools. So working on a project with a couple of colleagues here at Victoria University of Wellington. So lots of fun. Satire always beckons.
Great. Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you so much for sitting down with us, and thank you for your contribution to CIIS. It is much appreciated. So,
thanks. Thank you, David.